Thank you, Vern. Let's try that again, actually. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. It sounds like for people at home or in TV land, it sounds like there are really people here. It's not just one or two. I'm Dr. Jim Gimble, president of Concordia Lutheran Seminary here in Edmonton. I'm glad to be here. I'm very glad that you're here tonight. Last week with Dr. Maxfield, we had a wonderful introduction to this journey of Luther, and this evening that journey is going to continue. It feels like a hint of autumn in the air here. Feels like we should be home carving pumpkins or getting ready to, heat up some leftover turkey or something from Thanksgiving. But I'm glad that it's warm in the building, and I hope for those of you who are out in TV land, I hope you're in maybe a nice cozy place next to the fire or someplace warm. We are thrilled again to have Dr. John Maxfield from Concordia University Edmonton, international expert on Luther and Luther studies, back with us again tonight. He is a great resource, as you heard last week, and we really are thankful for his presence and his engagement with us. I'm assuming everyone knows, but for those who may not know, this is the 500th anniversary year of the nailing of the 95 Theses on the Castle Church door in Wittenberg, and that's why our focus is on that. Just another little plug, if I could. At the seminary this year, we are doing daily Reformation minutes. I don't know if you've seen those or had an opportunity to see them. Technically, they're a little bit more than a minute in length. It's hard to get anything of note into a brief minute, but we're focusing on some of Luther's music, some of the books, both the things that Luther himself wrote and books about Luther. We're focusing some of the artwork and other things that are part of that era and represent Luther in a visual format. And then we're also focusing on some of the other people relative to the Reformation. And you can find those on our website, and also there's a link on Facebook. So you should be able to find those if you're interested, and just a number of things that are brief there. But overall, it's a part of our mission through Quest and through Reformation Minute and through everything that we do here to form servants for Jesus' sake, to form pastors for the church, for Lutheran Church Canada. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for all the blessings that you provide to us each day, even with a hint of winter in the air. We're reminded of the warmth of your love. We're reminded of your sustenance, of your mercy and your grace. We give you thanks for the heritage that we have as we celebrate and observe those early parts and early steps toward the Reformation, particularly because through the Reformation, what was uncovered is part of our great treasure, the certainty of our forgiveness through faith in Jesus Christ, the merits and work that he did, exchanged for our sin on the cross. Through faith, Lord, we approach you with thanks and praise and ask you to open our minds as well as our hearts to your message tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So we welcome Dr. John Maxfield.
So, glad to have you here again tonight. Last week we talked about Luther's background, his family, and his education, and ended with how after achieving the Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degrees at the University of Erfurt, Luther was engaged in his first semester of law studies, the doctoral level studies at a medieval university, one of the three faculties of law, medicine, or theology. He was committed to the study of law, according to his father's plan for him. But after a brief visit home during his first semester of law studies, the summer semester of 1505, Luther, on the way back to the University of Erfurt after visiting home, was caught in a thunderstorm and, terrified, uttered the vow, "Help me, Saint Anne, I will become a monk." And so, indeed, in July of 1505, without his parents' permission, Luther bade farewell to his friends and entered the Augustinian cloister one of the several cloisters in Erfurt, which was known in the time as the Rome of Germany, for its many large churches, its several monasteries, and its teeming religious life. And that's where we're going to pick up tonight, looking at Luther's experience as in a monastery, first of all in Erfurt and later in Wittenberg, and then his studies as to the doctoral level, achieving the Doctor of Theology degree during his experience first at Erfurt again, and then completing that in Wittenberg. So, next slide. By entering a monastery, Luther was committing himself to what we might call the spiritual athleticism or the spiritual elite of Western, or really all of world Christendom. Since the 4th century, and known, although he may well not have been the very first, but St. Anthony of Egypt is regarded as the first monastic. That is, a person who decided that to be a true Christian and to truly live up to the commands of discipleship. Anthony, heeding the words of Jesus as he interpreted them to the rich man who asked, "What must I do to be saved?" And Jesus said, "Sell all that you have and give it to the poor and come follow me." Anthony of Egypt left Egyptian society under the Roman Empire in the early 4th century and went into the desert of Egypt as an ascetic, as a hermit, living alone and committing himself to a life of devotion to God. And this is really the beginning of monasticism. So by Luther's time, in the early 16th century, monasticism had been part of the culture of Christianity, originating in Egypt and Syria and spreading to the West, as we'll see, for over 1,000 years. And as this painting portrays, here we see Anthony, as he's often portrayed in the iconography of the Middle Ages, as doing battle with the devil and the demons in the wilderness. Because withdrawal into the desert was viewed not as an escape from spiritual warfare, but an escape from worldly concerns to a more intense spiritual warfare against the devil and the demons and in favor of devotion to God. So from these early hermits who retreated from the world, developed monastic traditions. In the West, they were shaped especially by Saint Benedict, next, the 5th century, early 6th century Roman, Benedict of Nursia, who devoted himself to the monastic life, leaving Roman society. He was raised in an aristocratic family, but he left his family and his wealth behind and established first himself and then a community of monks at Monte Cassino as a group of people devoted to God. And from Benedict developed what was known as the Rule of Saint Benedict, which really gave shape to the monastic traditions of the West, Western Europe or Western Christendom. Benedict's rule was a booklet of a series of numerous chapters that were read daily in the monastic community. His community was designed so that ordinary men or ordinary women could devote themselves to God and become these spiritual athletes or elite in the Christian community. And the theme of the Rule of St. Benedict is summarized by the words ora et labora, pray and work. The whole monastic life was devoted to devotion to God, prayer, study of God's word, but also manual labor, physical labor to emphasize the humility of the monastic life. Many monks were former aristocrats, wealthy people, but he wanted a pretty much egalitarian society of monks, all of whom were considered equals, all of whom were under the discipline of the rule and devoted to prayer and to manual labor. And in the Middle Ages in the West, monasticism became a very important tool for the church's expansion. Many of the early missions to the Germanic tribes that displaced the Roman Empire in the West. By that time, a Christian Roman Empire. Many of these tribes were evangelized by Benedictine monks. In the course of time, as monasticism struggled with its own inner life, there developed reform movements. We can go to the next slide. One of the most important was the movement of the 11th and 12th century, the Cistercians, that saw themselves as going back to the original impulses of Benedict's rule with a focus on simplicity and an unadorned church life and a very simple life. Many of the Benedictine cloisters by that time had become the objects of gift giving and had become very wealthy establishments and highly decorated. So Cistercian monasticism was a return to simplicity and really poverty. Then in the 12th and 13th centuries developed some new orders. First of all, the Dominicans, also known as the Order of Preachers, who, according to the insights of St. Dominic, devoted themselves to preaching and became famous as defenders of the faith. Many Dominicans were involved in the struggle of the Catholic Church in the High Middle Ages with heretical movements and were deeply committed to the Church's doctrine and to prosecuting heresy. They were also very much involved in the developing universities that we talked about briefly last time. In the 12th and 13th centuries, universities became established, and Dominican friars were often committed to that university life. Many Dominicans were committed to the Thomistic tradition of scholasticism that we talked about last time, the old way, the Via Antiqua. And so within the universities, these kind of factions or schools of theological understanding were sometimes mirrored in the order to which the university professors belonged. And so the Dominicans, Thomas Aquinas was himself a Dominican, and they were often very much in allegiance with this tradition in scholasticism. Also in the late 12th, early 13th century was the figure of St. Francis, who established the order of Friars Minor, or Little Brothers. St. Francis was the son of a wealthy merchant of cloth in northern Italy, and he abandoned his father's wealth, literally stripped himself naked to walk around and proclaim poverty as a special vocation of serious Christians. And the Franciscan order was an order really devoted to that particular vow that a monk might make, that of poverty. And also, we remember last week we talked about the Occamist or Via Moderna movement. William of Ockham was a Franciscan friar, and many of the Franciscans also devoted themselves to that tradition of a scholastic theology, the Via Moderna or nominalism. The order that Luther joined was that of the Augustinian hermits. They were established under the papal order in 1256. They were an order committed to scholarship and preaching, similar to the friars of the Franciscans and Dominicans. And maybe this is a good time to talk about one distinction between a monk in the strict sense, a Benedictine monk, whose whole life was taken up with the life of the cloister, and the friars. Dominican, Franciscan, and Augustinians were rather called friars, and they lived in the cloister, but they were much more involved in the community and didn't reserve themselves to that communal life behind the walls of the cloister. And the Augustinian cloister at Erfurt was of the Augustinian rule and of a particular movement that had developed late in the 15th century to bring reform to the Augustinian rule and its order. The Erfurt congregation or cloister was part of what was known as the German Reform congregation of Augustinian hermits. And when we talk about reform or observant orders, that would be within any particular order: Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians. Those who are more severely or more strictly tied to reviving the rule of the order were known as observants. And those cloisters or houses that were a little more relaxed about the ordered life were known as conventuals. And Luther decided to join the Reform or Observant congregation of Erfurt, a part of a larger German Reformed congregation of Augustinian hermits. So in July of 1505, Luther entered the monastic life. And this slide kind of gives us a picture of how the monks' or friars' day was organized. Very strict order of hours. If you look at this graph here, red is a particular public church service, beginning with prime at the earliest part of the day, what we call matins, and various later services all the way till after midnight. The last services, nocturnes and lauds in the middle of the night. Purple is a time of private reading and prayer. Green is physical labor. Blue is those periods of sleep. You see that sleep was interrupted numerous times. One went to bed quite early, but was woken up not long after midnight for the first public service, or for the first period of private reading, followed by the first service late in the night, nocturnes. It was a regimented life that was intended to develop self-discipline and self-withdrawal, as it were, or asceticism, kind of renouncing of self and devotion to the life of the community. So in July of 1505, Luther entered the Black Cloister at Erfurt. This is the way it appears today. You might ask, why is it not black? Next slide. It doesn't look at all black, but the reason for that is the cloister is known as the Black Cloister, not because of the color of the buildings, but rather because of the Augustinian's cowl, or the robe that an Augustinian friar would wear. And this is a photo I took of a cowl as it appears in the Augustinian cloister, still preserved today in Erfurt. So they were known as the Black Cloister because all of the friars were dressed in a cowl like this. Next slide. The door of the Augustinian cloister where Luther entered in July, I think it was July 2nd. No, it was 2 weeks after that. July 2nd was when he had the terrifying experience of the thunderstorm and uttered his vow. A few weeks after that, he entered through this door in the Augustinian cloister and was admitted into the guest house. And there would have been a period of several weeks where he would have been observed as he was alone to be sure that he was really suitable to make the vow that he was announcing that he intended to make. And so the next several slides are just the way the Augustinian cloister in Erfurt appears today. It's actually been revived as a evangelical monastic, semi-monastic community today. The church is preserved and services are held there. There are people that live in the cloister, and there's places for people to visit and stay overnight. Well, in the chapter house, Luther would have been brought before the assembly and would have been instructed about what it meant to enter into the life of an Augustinian friar. He would have been exhorted by the prior or leader of the individual cloister to renounce his own will, to devote himself to a very simple diet, to wear rough, rather uncomfortable clothing, to be ready for these night vigils where he would not sleep for any long periods of time, but be awakened for private or public worship. He would be exhorted to discipline his body, if necessary, to beat oneself into a true state of sorrow over one's sins. He would be called upon to utter the vows or to make the vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity, which all of the rules of monasticism were devoted to. And as one who had to give away all of his property before entering the monastic cloister, he would live totally within the means provided of the order. Often the Augustinians would beg for their food, although that was more the tradition and presence of the Franciscans, who had that special emphasis on their poverty. But through the disciplines of fasting and seclusion in one's monastic cell, one would develop this highly disciplined life of a friar. I think the only comparison that one could make today is the kind of disciplines developed in a military academy, where the goals are total renouncing and submersion of any kind of independence and selfhood to be merged into the unit and to learn total obedience to the order of command and to devote oneself to the life that one is entering. Well, the monk or friar being accepted as a novice would then have have a whole year of initiation and a probation. During this year, again, he would be observed carefully to make sure that he was ready to make the full vows of the cloister. And at that initiation, he would hear the rule of Great Father Augustine read. He would have his hair tonsured, and that shows the haircut, kind of like almost making a halo out of the hair. But this was symbolic of several things. The Germanic rulers, for example, all had long hair in the early Middle Ages, and in the West, where Benedictine monasticism developed, it was a sign of renouncing any position in society to cut one's hair to that extreme degree. The last Merovingian king of the Franks, ruler of the Franks, was removed from his office literally by having his hair shorn and made into a monk as a sign that he was no longer part of the ruling elite in Germanic society. Well, the friar Luther made such a vow willfully, and again entered this period of probation, and was granted a novitiate gown, kind of an entry-level sign again of what it meant to be an Augustinian friar. At the cloister church, which appears like this today, and also the next slide, Luther then would have lain prostrate before the altar to make his novice vows. He would have been accompanied by other friars who would have said prayers and sung hymns. He would have received the kiss of peace, and then he would have been received by the novice master for the year of his probationary novitiate. We know something about Luther's novice master. His name was Johann Greffenstein. Interesting that Luther describes Greffenstein as someone who was deeply concerned about him as a person and guided him in his devotional life, would have been active in hearing young Martin's confessions, deeply influential. It's also interesting that before the altar where Luther lied prostrate was buried, one of the people that had been at the Council of Constance and who had overseen the charges of heresy that had led to the condemnation of Jan Hus in 1415. I think we talked about that last time. In the late Middle Ages, some of the struggles the church has had. Well, Johann Greffenstein believed that Jan Hus was wrongfully condemned. So here in the space of the Augustinian cloister, he not only would have been in the presence of one of the inquisitors of Hus, but was influenced personally by someone that thought Hus was treated badly by the church 100 years prior. Well, next slide. In this novitiate year, Luther would have undergone regular instruction in the law of the order. He would have studied the commentary by a Parisian scholar and Benedictine monk Hugh of St. Victor, who studied the rule of Augustine and passed on traditions about that rule. And throughout this year, Luther would have taken up some of the skills that a friar needed to know, how to write carefully, because one of the great services of the monasteries was to copy texts and to preserve learning, how to genuflect properly, how to lay prostrate before the altar, how literally to have proper facial expressions in the midst of one's fellow friars and especially the public. So again, this is the context in which Luther lived during his several years in the Augustinian cloister in Erfurt. I think we'll move to the next slide and talk about how in the monastery Luther was successful in that novitiate year, and he then was initiated fully as a friar or monk in the Augustinian order. Upon the recommendation of his novice master, the door was open to him to make the full vows of an Augustinian hermit. And then he would have received the full cowl of the friar. The hymn "Come Holy Ghost" by the German theologian Rabanus Maurus, we still sing that today, was part of the liturgy of the initiation of the monk into the full monastic life. The evidence that we have, next slide, is that Luther was an exemplary friar. He strictly observed the traditions of the monastery and the rule of St. Augustine. He was very devoted to his study of theology in the monastery itself, reading the scripture. He was very concerned about his relationship with God. And he himself talks about how he was deeply concerned not only about his deeds and his sinful deeds, but about the motives behind even his good works. And some of the evidence is that not only did he trouble his novice master Johann Greffenstein, but his later mentor Johann von Staupitz with literally hours and hours of confessing and seeking some assurance that a great sinner like he could be forgiven. This was not untypical. It was part of the discipline of the friar's life. But it is clear that Luther was very, very concerned about his spiritual life to the point of some excessiveness, perhaps, in the confessional and concern about his motives and what his relationship with God really was. Nevertheless, as he once later described it, he really did, together with the other friars, thrive on this sense of a holy life. As he once said at table, we young monks sat still, opened wide our mouths and noses, and smacked our lips for joy over such delightful talk about our holy monkery. Not all monks were ordained into the priesthood, but Luther was. In May of 1507, he had his first Mass. That would have been after his ordination, some week or more before. But also later accounts by Luther himself of his first Mass tell us something about his personality and his devotion as an Augustinian friar. for when he was at the altar in the cathedral in Erfurt, saying his first Mass. He first said to his associate that he didn't think he could continue. He was terrified. He was urged to complete the service, which he did. But he later described feeling terror before God, as he knew that a priest in the Mass would consecrate the elements of bread and wine, and by a miracle of God would transform those elements into the body and blood of Christ. He would be in the real presence of his holy God. And he was terrified by that thought, and rather traumatized, I think, by the experience at the time. His father had come from Mansfeld to be at that service. And it's not known, I think, how his father reacted to his difficulties at the altar. But Luther does describe later on how he was confronted by his father in the aftermath of that critical event in his life, his first Mass. And he said to his father, "Well, now, isn't this better for you than my being a lawyer?" Him entering not only the monastery, but the holy priesthood of the church. To which Hans replied, "Have you not heard the commandment to honor your father and your mother?" We don't really know a great deal about Hans and Margareta Luther's reactions to Luther's commitment to enter the monastery. We know he did it without their permission. We know that it spoiled totally Hans's investment in his son's education, his plan for his son's future as a successful lawyer. But Luther himself does describe in some detail this confrontation with his father Hans after his first Mass. He later writes a letter to Father Hans. It's not something his father could have read. It was written in Latin, although he was probably told what it was said. But it formed the preface to a book, a short pamphlet that Luther wrote from the Wartburg in 1521, several years later, called The Judgment of Dr. Martin Luther on Monastic Vows. And Luther formed as a preface for this book, in which he discusses the validity of vows and renounces their validity. He forms the preface for this book in the form of a personal letter to his father. It's a very interesting document because it's quite personal, even though obviously it was not meant just for Father Hans. It was a public letter published. And as I mentioned, his father couldn't possibly have read it, although no doubt someone read it to him in some kind of German translation. But this is what Luther later writes in that preface of 1521 about this experience. "When in filial confidence I upbraided you for your wrath, you suddenly retorted with a reply so fitting and so much to the point that I have hardly ever in all my life heard any man say anything which struck me so forcibly and stayed with me so long. Have you not also heard, you said, that parents are to be obeyed? But I was so sure of my own righteousness that in you I heard only a man, and boldly ignored you, though in my heart I could not ignore your word. I know now that my vow was not worth a fig. But behold, how much good God, whose mercies are without number, and whose wisdom is without end, has made to come out of all this. Would you not now rather have lost 100 sons than not have seen this good?" It's interesting how Luther, in this book in which he criticizes the whole more than 1,000-year tradition of monasticism, and says that it is not valid to make permanent vows that undermine things that God himself has instituted, such as marriage, through the vow of celibacy. Or that one can believe that by entering this kind of life, that one can assure one's salvation through one's works, etc. In this book, when he makes judgments on monastic vows, Luther prefaces that material with sharing this very personal relationship with his father. and effectively says, I now criticize monastic life and the monastic vow from experience, from one who lived in this life, was exemplary in this life, was successful in this life, and yet found no resolution to my relationship with God. And more importantly, as he now recognizes, I undermined God's own commandment to honor your father and mother by disobeying you and entering the monastery. It's very important that we understand how important Luther's monastic experience was for his development into Luther the Reformer and as a theologian. Though he criticized and effectively said monastic vows were invalid in 1521, he himself continued to wear his monastic cowl at least until 1523. And one could say that he didn't really leave the monastic life until he got married in 1525. He lived his whole life, much of his life, in the context of Christian community, which is what monasticism is all about. As a child, when he studied first at Magdeburg and lived with the brethren of the common life that we talked about last week, that lay community of devotion to God, he grew accustomed to what it meant to live in a religious community. As a student, before entering the monastery, lived in the Bursa of the University of Erfurt, in the communal life of students. He understood what it meant to live in community. And from 1505, when he entered the Augustinian cloister in Erfurt, to the end of his life, 1546, in the Augustinian cloister in Wittenberg, where he still was living, even after marrying his wife Katie in 1525. The Elector of Saxony gave him the cloister as a wedding gift, and he continued to live in that space. And it wasn't just the nuclear family either. Probably 20 or 30 students or other boarders living in the Luther household throughout that time. So Luther really was shaped by these traditions of communal life in a cloister, devoted to God. And that's very important to understand as we consider Luther's theology and his development as a reformer. During the years, I believe it was 1515 to 1518, when Luther became involved in controversy over his 95 Theses, Luther served as provincial vicar in Germany. That is, he was given responsibility of over 12 Augustinian cloisters, and would have traveled to those cloisters and visited them, would have been responsible for communications and correspondence with the prior of each cloister, would have been responsible for transfers of brother friars between cloisters, or even the discipline of a friar in a neighboring cloister. In other words, Luther was not only very serious in his monastic life, but he was successful. He rose in the pecking order, as it were, through positions of very significant responsibility. And all of those things were very important for Luther's development as a person, as well as a theologian. When we consider Luther's participation in the German observant congregation of Augustinians, hermits, we need to see that this movement was itself a reform movement within Christendom. And monasticism had, throughout the 1,000 years of its existence, been continually involved in seeking reform in the church and calling the church back to its original vision of what it meant to be a Christian and to live in a Christian society. So much so that one German historian, Bernd Mahler, really made a striking statement, and I think a true statement, when he noted that Luther's development as a theologian and his, what we call Reformation discovery or rediscovery of justification by faith, was itself a monastic discovery. It's something that occurred in the context of a monastic life and deeply was shaped by monastic traditions of Christian living. And as you probably know, and we will talk about a little more, one decisive change of the Reformation was it did bring about an end of monasticism as a culture within churches that adopted the Reformation. Protestants generally do not have monasteries, although there are some examples of monastic institutions within evangelical or Protestant churches historically and even to this day. But as sharply as Protestantism rejected monastic traditions, and especially what was considered the works righteousness of this kind of life, we need to understand that the Reformation and Luther himself were deeply shaped by these traditions, by these understandings of what it meant to live as a Christian in community and in a serious devotion to God. In Luther's experience then in Erfurt and later at Wittenberg, there was a very close connection between this monastic life in the cloister and the university. And Luther was encouraged early on to continue his studies, now no longer in law or philosophy, but more specifically in theology. He was ordered by his mentor at the time, Johann von Staupitz, to take up theological studies leading to the doctorate. And Johann von Staupitz was a professor of theology or biblical studies at the University of Wittenberg and was the vicar general of all the German Augustinians. And so probably met Luther already in 1505 when he entered the monastery in Erfurt, and was in touch with Luther over the years. In the year 1508, Luther was called to go from Erfurt to Wittenberg and to teach in the monastery there for a year or at least a semester. And according to the developments of education at the time, he was ordered to lecture on the ethics of Aristotle. And so to not only imbibe that tradition of scholastic theology grounded in Aristotle that we talked about last week, but to begin teaching that to the monks of Wittenberg. Then in 1509, Luther received the first theological diploma, that of the Baccalaureus Biblicus, it was called, the Bachelor of Bible, literally, or Bachelor of Theology degree. And Luther achieved that in 1509, and then was ordered to go back to Erfurt, where he continued the typical progression of a scholar in theology, taking the next degree, that called the Sententiarius. That was to lecture formally on the 4 books of sentences by Peter Lombard. I think I mentioned this last time. Peter Lombard was a Parisian scholar who developed a textbook of theology that had been in use for since the 12th century and was kind of the standard theological textbook for theological studies in a medieval university. And so to lecture on the sentences and to develop a tradition of commenting on that text was part of the development of a theologian formally. And one earned this degree, the Sententiarius, as recognition that one had successfully commented on the sentences of Peter Lombard. We also know that just as Luther's arts studies or studies of philosophy had been influenced at Erfurt through the tradition of nominalism or the Via Moderna, so also his studies of theology were deeply influenced by this tradition. And if we go to the next slide, we can kind of summarize this by emphasizing that both at Erfurt and Wittenberg, both in the monastery and in the universities of both towns, Luther learned scholastic theology, mediated through the Via Moderna or Ockhamism. He learned a discipline of personal devotion that emphasized the centrality of experiencing God personally and truly seeking to relate to God personally and through the disciplines of the life of the cloister. And finally, he learned, and critically, he learned some of the tools of the humanist movement that we talked about last time. There was a strong humanist movement at the University of Erfurt, and even stronger at the brand new University of Wittenberg, which had been established only in 1502, and became truly committed to this new way of scholarship that was taking Europe by storm by the late 15th and early 16th centuries. At Erfurt, in particular, humanism and scholasticism were viewed as complements. So they kind of lived side by side. There were certain scholars committed to humanist disciplines, others that were committed to the nominalist scholasticism. But in Wittenberg, when Luther went there first for a year in 1508 and later transferred to the monastery and university there, humanism saw itself much more in an antagonistic relationship, a critical relationship to scholasticism. And as we'll see, they sought to displace scholastic traditions of theology with this new discipline of the liberal arts and going back to the sources of antiquity. Johann von Staupitz, as I've mentioned, was the vicar general of the German congregation of Augustinian hermits. That is, he would have been the highest level of Augustinian friars in Germany. And he was, as I've mentioned, professor of Bible at Wittenberg. And when Luther was visiting there, Staupitz ordered him to take up doctoral studies and to complete the doctorate so he could be Staupitz's own successor at the University of Wittenberg. And so, and Luther even describes later a meeting with Staupitz by the pear tree, he says, at the Augustinian cloister in Wittenberg, where over his objections, Staupitz said, "You must study theology and get your doctorate." And Luther said, "I can't do that. That's too much work, etc., etc." He didn't see himself capable, but he was ordered to do so, and he did, following that monastic vow of obedience. And that was a very important, of course, development for Luther as a theologian. And the influence of Staupitz was significant for him throughout these developing years. This is a map that just shows the several congregations of the German, or cloisters of the German congregation of Augustinian hermits throughout Germany, quite a few. And the colors of red and green and blue represent a particular conflict that developed in the course of 1511 probably, or possibly 1510, among the Augustinians in Germany. And we can go to the next slide. That had to do with a plan that Staupitz was developing to unite the observant and the conventual cloisters within the German congregation into one movement under his leadership. It was opposed by the cloister at Erfurt, where Luther had been and possibly still was, because they felt that if you united the strict observance with the more relaxed conventuals, you'll water down the reform, the goals of the strict observance. And so they opposed that. And Luther was chosen then to be sent to Rome, actually to make an appeal over against Staupitz's plan to the Augustinian order and even to the Pope in Rome. And there's a dispute among scholars. It was always held to be originally in November 1510 that Luther went from Erfurt, was sent to Rome on this expedition, as it were. A particular study of, I think, within the last 5 or 10 years, carefully analyzing the sources, comes to the conclusion that it was a year later, and after Luther had transferred to the cloister in Wittenberg, that he was sent. My two favorite new biographies, the one by Hendricks favors the later dating, the other one by Heinz Schilling still favors the earlier dating, so I can't make up my mind, and I'll have to eventually read this study myself, I guess. But the point is, Luther was in a kind of difficult position where his cloister in Erfurt was resisting the plan of the Vicar General, Staupitz, who was Luther's own mentor. And Luther was the one who was sent to make this appeal, as it were. Whether early or late, whether he returned in April 1511 or April 1512, Luther ends up transferred permanently now to the cloister in Wittenberg. And after the appeal in Rome failed, Luther switched loyalties to Staupitz's union proposal. Although the evidence is that this union never did occur anyway, things continued to develop with the two movements in the German congregation nonetheless. And so we have Luther moving from Erfurt northeast to Wittenberg, not far away, but living in a very different community, and that's where he will spend the rest of his life. And the next several slides will first of all show the one long trip, the only trip out of Germany that Luther ever took, when he walked together with a singular other friar all the way from Erfurt or Wittenberg down to Rome. 2 months by foot. Two graduates at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I did my doctoral studies, and they were there a couple years after me in the program, reenacted this walk I think in 2010, thinking that was the 500th anniversary. And they published a book about it, actually. I think it's called Here I Walked, and it kind of translates their experience of making this journey as a pilgrimage, as it were, and reflecting on what it might have meant for Luther and what it means for Christians today to go to Rome and visit the holy places there. Well, earlier or later, Luther ends up in this little town of Wittenberg. And it truly is a small town. Today it's a little larger, but you still get the character of the old town, which is portrayed in this old engraving or woodcut image. If we see a few other slides, you can see the old town with the dominant St. Mary's Church in the center of town, the town church, where Luther was called early on to be a preacher and regularly preached in that church throughout his life in Wittenberg. On the one end of the town, if we go to the next slide, we get a modern tourist map. On the east end of the town is the Augustinian cloister, where Luther spent his life, and the university. And on the west end of the town, it's only about a mile, so about a 15-minute walk. Down one of the two main streets through the old town is the castle where the Elector of Saxony had one of his principal residences, and the castle church, where not only would the Elector have worship when he was home at that particular residence, but where he kept a very valuable collection of relics. Frederick the Wise was loved collecting relics of the saints, and one received indulgence for visiting those relics. And so all of this is the dynamic that we'll see propels Martin Luther into Luther the Reformer, which we'll be talking about next week. So in this little town, the next several slides just are some pictures of the way Wittenberg looks today. Luther spends his entire life and really changes. His influence in this little town changes the world. This is the Augustinian cloister. Near the Augustinian cloister was the university known as Lucoria. Lucoria is simply the Greek word, which means Wittenberg in Greek, and Wittenberg is a translation into English, White Mountain. It's just a little hill. But this was Flemish immigrants and Wends that lived in Wittenberg. And they were so used to totally flat land that when they came to Wittenberg and saw this little rise, they called it the White Mountain. And so when Frederick the Wise established a university there in Wittenberg in 1502, so very recent, just less than 10 years before Luther came there, it was known as the Lucoria and became a center of humanist studies and very important for the developing Reformation. So the Lucoria was a medieval university. Again, it was established in 1502 by Frederick the Wise. Frederick had a problem. Saxony, under his father, I believe, had been divided into two regions, what we call electoral Saxony and ducal Saxony. His cousin, Duke George, was in charge of a different area of Saxony, and that area had the only university, the University of Leipzig. So when Frederick established Wittenberg as his residence, he decided he needed a university and established the Lucoria again in 1502. It was then very recent in comparison to the historic universities of Germany. Most of these developed in the High Middle Ages out of the cathedral schools of very important cities like Paris and Oxford and Cambridge or Bologna. And the earliest universities were developed already in the 12th and early 13th centuries. But they existed as schools, what they were called studium generale prior to this. And by the early 16th century, Europe had more than 50 active universities that were established not just by the papacy, as most were in the High Middle Ages, but many by the prince or the local government. And so among these were the University of Erfurt, where Luther studied and lived, the University of Heidelberg, the University of Cologne and Leipzig, etc. And like Wittenberg in 1502, Frankfurt on the Oder River was a new development in the early 16th century, being founded in 1506. So Luther at Wittenberg was deeply influenced by his mentor Johann von Staupitz. He was completed his doctoral studies by the fall of 1512, and October 19th of that year he was made Doctor of Theology, or also known Doctor of Sacred Scripture. And then he would prepare himself to lecture on the Scriptures as his mentor had done before him. And the evidence that we have says that Luther began formally his lectures the following fall in 1513. His job would have been to lecture 2 hours daily in theology, and he chose, like his mentor Staupitz, to devote all of his theological lectures to biblical exegesis, to lecturing on the Bible. And in the summer semester, they met quite early, 6 a.m., in the winter, 7. Heinz Schilling, in his new biography, says that changed at some point, and Luther lectured in the afternoons for a time. But this would have been his calling from this point until the very end of his life, to be a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg and living quite close by in the Augustinian cloister. And the next slides just again show what some of these places look like today. This is the Lucoria, or the university as it appears today, in the entrance. And this is the town church and the town square. Again, just a 10-minute walk or so from the university. And that's from the towers of the St. Mary's Church, looking down toward the castle church. You see the tower of the castle church, again, not very far away at all. So in this tiny town, probably 2,000 residents, Luther changes from simple friar and professor of theology to Luther the Reformer. And from that develops the Reformation that changes Western society. So it's remarkable that this we might describe it today as the academic Siberia of the time, becomes so central in these developments. So we'll take a break now, and after about 10 minutes, we'll continue to look at what it meant for Luther to be a professor of theology and how his theology matured in that vocation.